Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast. Terminal Philosophy and I will finish our series on the Roman unification of Italy, which will cover the First Samnite War, the Latin War, and the Second and Third Samnite Wars. Now, the Samnites were a Oscan-speaking hill people in southeastern Italy. So they were north of the Greek city-states in the toe and heel of Italy, Magna Graecia, and they were in the upper eastern mountain highlands of the Apennines, and then further south was the rich fertile areas of Capua and Campania. They were in the tribal associations. The four main tribes were the Hiperni, the Caudini, the Caracini, and the Petrini. And so, in about 354 BC, Rome and the Samnite tribes signed a treaty that demarcated their boundaries at the river Liris. And it's this river and who has claims on which side of it that become the real crux of much of the conflict between Rome and the Samnites. So the First Samnite War begins in the 340s. And so what happens in this conflict is there's a city-state called Sidicini, which is in Campania and is fighting the Samnites who are invading. They seek the aid of the Campanians, Capua, and other city-states, and they decide to join in. And the Capuans seek Roman aid. Rome says, we're not interested in fighting the Samnites right now. And so they voluntarily submit to Roman rule, which forces the Romans' hand because now Capua is a Roman territory, Roman dominion. And so they go and fight the Samnites for the freedom of Capua. Now, one of the things that you'll see is, on the one hand, Livy tries to portray this as Rome sticking up for the little guy, the Sidicini, which is, of course, part of Rome's overall propaganda strategy to maintain high morale amongst the troops. But geostrategically, southern Italy is this fertile breadbasket, which, if it fell into the hands of the Samnites, would greatly increase their power. And if it could be guaranteed for the Romans, could give Rome food security, which, as we saw in some of his earlier wars with the Latins and Etruscans, Rome was at the verge of starvation at numerous times in its earlier history. So, the cynic might say it was all political, but I think it's probably a mixture of both. I mean, obviously, self-interest is a major factor in determining nations' interests, but I don't think it's solely that, because most people aren't sociopaths and have to have some other moral reason to do so. And briefly speaking, the First Samnite Wars is somewhat short and inconclusive. There are three major battles: Mons Graurius, Saticula, and Sisula, where the Romans sort of engage and defeat the Samnites to preserve their control of Campania. Now, the Battle of Graurus, what's the two consuls, Marcus Valerius Corvus and Aulus Cornelius Cassus, basically, it's largely inconclusive. They fight around the Roman camp. But what ends up happening is we see again that Roman cavalry is sort of decisive. After inconclusive skirmishing, now this time the horsemen dismount, and then a combination of the sort of Roman dragoons, if you will, because a dragoon is a cavalryman that dismounts and fights like an infantryman, and then the Roman forces together sort of pressure the Samnites to finally break in the third assault. In the second battle of Saticula, the Samnites they're trying to lay a ambush on a narrow mountain pass, but the Romans are able to determine this, and P. Decius Mus, a Roman military tribune, instead outflanks the Samnite position and attacks them at night. And it throws them into confusion, and they scatter, not imagining the Romans could actually get behind them in this area. And in the Battle of Sisulia, the Samnites again are facing the Romans, but what ends up happening is, in this case, they attack the Roman camp. They don't think the Romans are present, and so they disperse their troops from their own camp to forage. But the Romans are present in sufficient numbers and storm the Samnite camp directly, and then defeat these foragers piecemeal. And at this point, the Romans continue to pillage Samnite territory for them to sue to peace. Now, it's to both sides' purposes to sue for peace because the Samnites are not having a very good time in this war. And as we'll see very shortly, Rome will have its hands full with the Latins. So the First Samnite War is largely inconclusive, but what it does demonstrate is that there is going to be pretty much two governing principles for the rest of the conflicts. One is, where does the boundary between Samnite and Roman territory really lie? Because while Sidicini and Capua are south of the Liris, that's not actually Samnite territory. The Samnites will claim, well, everything south is ours, and the Romans are like, well, hold on, just your half of south of the Liris is yours. And so that's going to be one of the contentious issues all the way through. And we'll also see that the Samnites will be able to give the Romans a good run for their money. Probably, we all know about Rome and Carthage. We all know about Rome and Pyrrhus. But the Samnites gave Rome its really first great challenge for hegemony.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. With the First Samnite War, it was, largely inconclusive, and there was only, really three major battles, which you had mentioned, that are associated with the First Samnite War. And I think it's fair to say that the Samnites are probably Rome's toughest opponent in their greater conquest of Italy. Now, of course, in the previous wars where there was the humiliation of the destruction of Rome by the Gauls and sending raids down from the north, but the Samnites were really much more well organized than the Gauls and had better armed troops, and they actually had their own formation system, which some historians disagree on this, but where the maniple system comes into play. And we'll discuss here in a moment in the Second Samnite War how the Greek phalanx was swapped out for the maniple system because, with the disaster at the Caudine Forks, Rome needed a way to, field troops in battle that could, face the, one direction, but can deal with threats from the flanks as well. So it was, something of a more refined reserve system to fight in multiple directions. And just for the context of the First Samnite War, some of the events that led up to it is that after the Gallic invasion left Rome destroyed, that gave Rome time to rebuild, and they did rebuild pretty quickly. And that's one thing that you don't want to give Rome is time to reassess and reorganize. And so in the 380s, the Gauls retracted back up north and away from Latium, giving the Romans time to build what was known as the Servian Wall, which would help Rome repel later raids by the Gauls in 360, 359, and 349. And so that was an interesting and sort of a critical defensive layer that Rome needed for a long time. We discussed this with previous conflicts with the Volscians and the Etruscans. But yes, as you mentioned before, the Samnites were basically a confederation of those four main tribes and, of the Apennine Mountains. And when Samnites would go to war, they are basically band together under one military leader. And so this is what made them much more of a threat than the Etruscans, because the Etruscans never were able to organize as well as the Samnites. And so with that in place, there was, of course, the treaty with Rome. The main treaty that surrounded the First Samnite War was this sort of disagreement across the Liris River Valley in 354 BC. The Samnites thought that, all of Campania was theirs, but the Romans were saying, well, no, it's everything east of the Liris River is yours, and to the west is ours. So that is kind of the source of the dispute. Now, I think what would, Rome in many times, throughout this 5th century BC was largely on the defensive, and their growth was basically limited to the area around Latium. And with the campaign seasons of the First Samnite War into Campania are basically considered some of Rome's more daring and larger expansions into the greater Italian peninsula. Campania was another coastal region just south of Latium. It was considered more of a fertile plain for agriculture. And Campania had originally been conquered by the Samnites previous to the First Samnite War. And over time, the Samnites that occupied Campania, they more or less became, culturally more soft compared to the Samnites in the mountains. So when war breaks out in 343 BC, this is due to multiple Samnite raids into Campania, the tribes from the mountains coming down to the coast. And of course, the Samnites lay siege to Capua, and the Romans the Capua ends up pleading to Rome for help, and the Romans defeat the Samnite siege of Capua. And with that, the Roman garrison, which was put in place afterwards, mutinies because they wanted a share of the war booty. And so, of course, this is what sets up the context for the Latin League revolts, which, Rome agrees to form a treaty with Samnium, and Rome passes a law to split war booty with the soldiers. But this is sort of the context that leads right into the Latin League, they're kind of called two things, the Latin League revolts or the Latin War.
Exactly. Now, the Latin War is from 340 to 338 BC. And the way the Latin War starts is the position south of the Liris is still inconclusive. And so the Sidicini and the Campanians are still sort of resisting the Samnites. And Latium wants to get involved in this as well. And the Samnites are like telling the Romans that they need to rein their allies in. And then Rome kind of gives a mixed response. Rome kind of says, well, we can't really control them. And in fact, the Latins are not really completely subjugated to Rome in the first place. Capua is, which they ordered to stand down, but not the Latins, which the Samnites sort of saw as Rome being a bit dodgy here. And the Samnites also wanted free jurisdiction to fight the Latins. The Latins wanted free jurisdiction to fight the Samnites on their own terms without Roman oversight. And that ultimately led to a revolt because they viewed that the Romans were restraining them from their own interests. And now what's interesting in Livy's account, this is the first time we see the terms hastati, principe, and triarii used. And he makes mention that the Latins were trained in the Roman legionary fashion, and it's legion against legion. Now, if we take Peter Connolly's theory, which I think is correct, the Livian legion is a halfway house between a full phalanx and the full Polybian legion. And what we were likely seeing here is that there's this intermediate legion, which, as Peter Connolly says, was more defensive oriented, in which case it shows more of its indebtedness to the phalanx itself. So like the Rorarii and the Cassensi were both spearmen as well. So it's like a three lines of spearmen, and that's more of a defensive position. Now, this is also a rather short war, and there are three main battles that determine the outcome of the Battle of Vesuvius, the Battle of Tryphanium, and the Battle of Peduum. And at the Battle of Vesuvius, consuls Titus Manlius Torquatus and Publius Decius Mus engage the Latins in battle. Now, what makes this battle important is we see the first use of the Romans commander committing an act of self-sacrifice, where he offers a sacrifice to one of the gods or group of gods, and then says that he pledges to sacrifice his life for their sake for the victory of the Romans, as a way to morale boost. It's not quite the same as a Japanese kamikaze, but you can see certain similarities with that. And basically, what ends up happening in the battle. Oh wait, I'm sorry, I got the wrong battle mixed up. This first battle was before the devotion. This first battle was when the Romans crossed the river Vesirius, and Manlius' son engaged the Latin champion, who was ordered to stand down. which he didn't anyhow. And then he executed his son, which showed the power of the paterfamilias and commander over his son. And then when the battles did happen, oh, this is Devotio. Yeah, okay. So this is the pre-battle, was when his son violated his orders. Then the actual battle was with the Devotio. Publius charges into the Latin forces, gets himself killed. This raises the morale of the Romans, and they defeat the Gauls. So two important things here. One is that we see that the principle behind the paterfamilias, which allowed a father to kill his own son, was not so that you could just randomly off your son. The point was, if you have a sort of ticklish situation like military discipline or a civil magistrate over a criminal, the loyalty to one's family would be subordinated to loyalty to duty to the state. And we see the idea that a Roman general sacrificing himself for victory would become was begun as a precedent in the Latin War. At the Battle of Tryphanum, Manlius pursues the Samnites, and they fight each other. They abandon their baggage train and engage. And Livy doesn't say much about the battle other than the Latins were completely routed. But what it sounds like is that since both sides had left their baggage trains, it was more like two flying columns engaging rather than a fully set piece battle. And then the decisive battle that ends the conflict is the Battle of Pedum. And the Latins at this point are not really able to take independent military action. They sustained so many losses that they're going to pursue more of a, what we would later call a Fabian strategy, defending the cities and harassing the Romans to sort of bleed them dry. But the Roman consuls Gaius Maenius and Lucius Furius Camillus were tasked with taking the crucial city of Pedum. And the Latin reinforcements from Tibur and Praeneste had also arrived at Pedum. And other forces from Aricia, Lanuvium, and Velatria were seeking to cross the river. Now, presumably, if all of these armies had converged on Pedum, it would have been impossible to take. But the Roman commander under Manius defeated the Latins at the river crossing of Astura. So presumably, as they were attempting to cross the river, he defeated them piecemeal. Again, these accounts are not given a lot of detail. And he then comes to besiege the city of Pedum, which was already under siege by Camillus. And then the combined Roman forces took the city of Pedum. Now, what's important here is that the Latins, when they were defeated, were given full Roman citizenship, which on the one hand does sound magnanimous, and as we mentioned elsewhere, it was, but it also served a useful purpose for Rome in that it gave them a direct manpower pool. It wasn't just allies who had a little bit more autonomy. They were directly under Roman military discipline. And at this point, Rome finally has a sort of critical mass, like a snowball, if you will, that it can then use to not only crush its local enemies in Italy, which it does, but then eventually Pyrrhus and the Carthaginians. And so what we see is that the steamroller of Rome that isn't really stopped until the Teutoburg Forest in Cara in the 1st century BC is the result of this turning point. And I think these are the important things to take away from the from the Latin Revolt.
Well, right. I think that's a great summary of the Latin War. And just as a quick recap, the Latin War really started as a result of these other various Latin cities taking advantage of the mutiny that happened in Capua, and probably a fair comparison to this would be something like the Athenians and the Delian League. The Latins saw themselves basically as subjects rather than citizens or part of the greater Roman project. And the Campanians and the Volsci joined the Latins in the fight against Rome and saw themselves as sort of a bit of a loose confederation against what they considered a hostile Roman aggression. And so with this, you basically had, and what this is something that really came about, after the Latin Wars. In previous videos in this early stage of Rome, we talked about how Rome was successful in not only, in this adoption of the maniple system, um, with a plebeian system and things like that, but also, they were good at managing their own politics, both in, with Rome itself and outside of Rome. And what happened as a result of this, after the three major victories that Rome had accomplished with the Battle of Tryphanum, as well as at the Battle of Vesuvius, where they are actually allied with the Samnites against this loose confederation of Volci and Latin tribes. What ended up happening is that Rome starts to reorganize itself with 4 different types of settlements. And the settlements are organized around full citizenship, partial citizenship, someone who's a town that's considered a Roman ally, and then the 4th category, which is a bit more important, which is establishing colonies. Obviously, with full citizenships, they have the right to vote in Roman assemblies, the right to hold public office. Partial citizenships is something like you can trade with Rome, marry Roman citizens. Roman allies basically agree to help Rome in times of war, although not every single Roman ally is necessarily forced to join. It's very situational. And then, of course, colonies are set up by Rome where it's the same culturally and linguistically, and shares the same religion as Rome itself. And so there's, on the one hand, you've got, this steamrolling military, but then on the other hand, you have a whole cultural, political aspect to it in this conquest of Italy. So that really starts to get going after the Latin League revolts. And so, after the Latin League is done away with forever, Rome doesn't want to deal with this level of mutiny again. And so that's why this type of citizenship model is introduced. Now, it's not introduced everywhere. It's not introduced on a ubiquitous scale, but the effects of this citizenship model its effects will multiply over time.
Yes. Now, with the Second Samnite War, with regards to the First Samnite War, we can argue that the provocation was a bit murky on both sides. It was a legitimately contested border, and it got complicated. The Second Samnite War is a little less complicated. Rome is really upping the ante here. Rome founds a colony for Fragile on the Samnite side of the Liris River. So it's not just in Campania. It's not just a city in Campania that's contested. It's the Samnite side. So Rome is clearly pushing the envelope and trying to call the Samnites bluff. And initially, the Romans are successful in the Second Samnite War. One major innovation is the idea of the proconsul. Normally, a consul would serve for a predetermined amount of time and then be rotated out. Now, in a long, protracted military conflict, the war might be continuing even after their consulship expired. And it would be either inconvenient or impossible to recall the consul. So they created this emergency position called the proconsul, which would allow the consul to continue service beyond a predetermined expiration date based on the campaign. Now, once you saw the campaign determination, then you have to stand before the Senate and, be replaced by the next cycle of consuls. But the initial phase was led by Quintius Publius Philo and Cornelius Lentulus. And the Romans took Naples through the use of defectors, as well as cities like Alafe, Calife, and Rufem. The Lucanians and Apulians allied with Rome as a result of its early victories. The Vestini allied with the Samnites. Consuls Decius Junius Brutus and Scavia pillaged Samnite territory. And a lot of this early period is sort of pillaging and harassing Samnite territory. The original peace offer by the Samnites was rejected by the Romans because the Romans demanded more than they could actually be expected to demand. Now, what we see here is I forgot to mention the duration of the conflict. The duration of the Second Samnite Wars, 326 to 304 BC. Now, 321 is the decisive point in the war, the Battle of Caudine Forks, where the two consuls, this is almost sort of like it's not quite as brutal because they're not executed, but it's almost a Cannae-like disaster. The Roman consuls Titus Viturius and Calvinus and Spurius Postumius Albinus lead their Roman forces into this mountain pass defile. The Samnite commander, the wily Gaius Pontius, sends 10 of his men dressed as shepherds and say that the Roman city of Lucaria is under attack, which it's not. But he assumes that the Romans will take the most direct path to relieve the city, which walks right into an ambush. And so as the Romans march through the pass, as they get to the exit, they find it walled off and defended by Samnite forces. And then as they retreat and retrace their steps, they see the rear blocked off, and they see the mountains all surrounded by Samnite warriors. So they're completely surrounded in an impossible position. And what ends up happening is Gaius asks his father Herennius what he should do with the Romans. It's almost like he didn't expect to be this successful. It's almost like when the dog finally gets the tire of the car that he's chasing, he doesn't know what to do with it. And his father Herennius says, well, first, just free the Romans. Just let them go. And he's like, well, I don't want to do that. And then his father says, well, why don't you kill all the Romans? And he's like, thinking his dad's gone crazy. So he has his dad Herennius come and say, explain yourself. And Herennius says, well, if you let the Romans go, you'll win their friendship. If you kill all these troops, then you'll cripple Rome for generations. And he's like, I don't want to do that. I want to humiliate the Romans. And so he creates a kind of a door archway with 3 spears, and it's called passing under the yoke, which is deeply humiliating to the Romans. And really, for the next 6-7 years, Rome is not really able to directly engage decisively the Samnite forces. Now, what is the reason why Rome sort of delays in this conflict after this? I mean, one, they weren't all killed. These troops weren't slaughtered like a Cannae. So it would seem that what they're doing is in the process of reorganizing their military forces. Now, one theory is that the Samnites were using the manipular system. And as we mentioned, I think in an earlier video, maniple means handful, anywhere from 80 to 100 men. And given the rough mountainous terrain of Samnium, it would give them a mobility advantage and a decisive advantage over the Romans. And so I think a very good explanation for this is that the Romans were spending those 5 years to reorganize their forces to be able to successfully push the Samnites to defeat. But in this period, the Roman consuls in 319 BC, Quintus Aemilius Barbula took Ferentinum, and Quintus Publius took Satricium. And in 317, Apulia was taken. Now, the defeat of the Romans at the Caudine Forks did give the Samnites pretty much total military dominance of everything south of the Liris. And a lot of Rome's allies and cities were pressured. Now, there's this one battle called Latuleae, which is really difficult for me to figure out because all the tertiary sources say it was a crushing Samnite victory. But if you read Livy, he says it was a Roman victory. The tertiary sources say that this battle is also referenced by Diodorus Siculus and Dionysius of Halicarnassus, both of which I looked up and couldn't find any evidence of this battle there. So I don't know what to make of the Battle of Latuleae, other than that it's confusing how the tertiary sources discuss it. In 314, the Samnites take Asua, Asuana, and Minturani and continue to press their advantage. They even took the city that the Romans founded that started the whole conflict, Fregellae. Now, 2 things happen in 312 that are important. One is the construction of the Appian Way, which will eventually give Rome decisive military dominance over Campania, and hence the Samnite heartland as well, because they can move troops to the battlefield faster than the Samnites can. Because on a paved road, a disciplined Roman force could cover 20 miles in a day, which is pretty much like a blitzkrieg in antiquity. And the Etruscans join the conflict. The Samnites are one of Rome's early enemies that really understands the need to attack Rome from multiple vectors. They seem to understand that they can't defeat Rome alone. They need allies. The problem is the Etruscans are disunited factions of city-states, and it's difficult to get everybody to show up when they say they're going to show up. The Romans engage the Etruscans in the decisive battle of Vadimo. Both sides fight till near exhaustion, and both deploy their reserves. Again, the Roman cavalry, dismounted, fighting as dragoons, break the Etruscans. So we see again the prominence of Roman cavalry in these early battles. The Etruscans try to march on Rome itself and seek allies from the Umbrians, but they're thrust into the Roman territories, also defeated by Quintus Fabius at Persua. At this point, it's 308 BC, and the Etruscans sue for peace. The Samnites gained the Umbrians as allies, but the Umbrians were the ones that marched on Rome, but they were also defeated by Decius, who ambushes them. And so now we see the Umbrians destroyed, and now it's just Rome versus Samnium. And basically at this point, the Samnites are exhausted. Their allies have been defeated. The Romans are ascendant and start waging a battle of scorched earth throughout most of Samnium and defeat them at the decisive battle of Tifernum. Now, what we see is even Livy's confused on this a bit, because he argues either it was an indecisive battle or the Romans were crushed. But eventually the capital city of Bovanium was taken, bringing the Etruscans to heel. Now, the big strategic picture here is the Samnites are beginning to realize that to defeat the Romans, they need to bring in a full coalition. The Umbrians, the Etruscans, both of whom we'll see in the Third Samnite War, and later the Gauls. So we already see that the Samnites have an idea of what they need to do to beat the Romans, but they weren't able to fully bring that to bear in the Second Samnite War. We'll actually see Rome's greatest test in the Third and final Samnite War.
Right. Yeah. The Second Samnite War is interesting in the sense that, the Caudine Forks is one of the main centerpieces of it because it's such a huge Roman humiliation, similar to the sacking of Rome in the 38 or in around 380 BC by the Gauls. It's very much, very similar on that same level where, Roman troops being disarmed is like one of the most humiliating things for a Roman soldier to go through. With the Second Samnite War, Rome does quite well in the opening stages. The Romans invade Samnium and win multiple battles, and Neapolis is occupied by Rome. Neapolis, was initially a Greek colony, which had some internal struggles, meaning that one part of Neapolis favored the Samnites and the other favored Rome. And so this created a lot of internal problems with Neapolis. And, Neapolis considered a major trading colony in the Mediterranean. So this was a huge victory for Rome. And Neapolis at the time was also considered quite a large city for its time. And, the Samnites sue for peace, but Rome actually rejects those terms. And then, of course, in 321, you have the humiliation at the Caudine Forks, where this forces Rome to, as you had mentioned earlier, reassess how they field troops in battle, because, this ended up being some trickery on the part of the Samnites, which, again, they're on their home turf in the Apennine Mountains, and basically luring the Romans through narrow passes where they weren't able to set up in their traditional Greek phalanx formations. And so this is, of course, the great, changing of the Roman army switches from the maniples system and away from the Greek-styled phalanx. But regardless of the defeat at the Caudine Forks, on the diplomatic side of things, the Romans create alliances with Lusania and Apulia. This basically surrounds Samnium with various enemies. And what you had mentioned earlier is, I think, absolutely spot on, is that the Samnites could defeat Rome in battle because they were a great competitor, but it was hard for them to take them head on. And, we had seen that in the first Samnite War. And so, what they really needed was, a combined coalition against Rome. And basically, I think your overall summary, the Second Samnite War, is spot on. But I think the Third Samnite War is basically an attempt by by the Samnites and all these other various tribes to try and keep Roman expansion at bay. But I think what we'll find out in that is that the Third Samnite War basically just concludes with Rome ascending as this basically the uncontested military champion of Italy.
Exactly. As a quick reference to the end of the Second Samnite War, Rome's military strength was further augmented by giving the Hernici, Sabines, and the old enemy, the Volscians, citizenship, which of course greatly increased Roman military might. So, including Samnium, only Etruria and Umbria were still independent in central Italy. Now, the Third Samnite War is arguably Rome's greatest test in this struggle because for the first time, all of Rome's enemies are organized to fight at the same time. So prior wars with Volscians, prior wars with Latins, prior wars with Etruscans, they don't all get attacked at the same time. There was no unified vision. But there was with this war. And this war starts with the Gauls. Titus Maelius Torquatus was marching to aid a friendly Gallic tribe, the Picentes, to fight the Senones. And the Senones were one of the Gallic tribes that marched with Brennus to sack Rome. Now, he died in a riding accident in Etruria. And the Etruscans thought this was a great time to strike at Rome. And the new consul, Marcus Valerius Corvus Silanus, pillaged Etruria in order to force them to remain inside their fortified city. So again, another scorched earth mentality here. The city of Lucania asked Rome for protection against the Samnites. Rome agreed. Rome told the Samnites to stand down. They refused. And so war began there as well. Now, the Second Samnite, or the Third Samnite War lasts from 298 to 290 BC. And at the beginning of the war, Lucius Cornelius Scipio Barbatus was tasked with fighting the war in Etruria. Gnaeus Fulvius Maximus Centumalus was tasked with waging war in Samnium. Now, what's interesting here is Rome now has the capability to fight on two independent fronts, which really none of Rome's competitors have the capacity to do that. And this capacity is the result of Rome's manpower reserves, which we'll get to in a future episode when Livy writes the first alternative history about Alexander the Great squaring off against Rome. He states that there was around, assuming Alexander didn't invade, that'd be around 320, the Second Samnite War. Rome had 300,000 reserves during the Second Samnite War. So given all the citizens they got at the end of that, we're talking maybe 400,000 that Rome has. That dwarfs what the Samnites and the Etruscans can bring to the table in any one fight. And we're beginning to see how the scales of power tipping in Rome's favor. Barbatus pursues more of a scorched earth strategy in Etruria, but Gnaeus captures the cities of Bovanium and Fodina and Samnium. The Romans initiate peace talks with the Etruscans, which allows for a more concerted push on Samnium. Quintus Fabius marches through Sora and Publius Decius through the territory of the Sidicini. The Samnite army was defeated at Tifernum by Quintus Fabius, and Publius Decius defeated an army at Meliventum and an Apulian army at Meliventum, which was seeking to join the Samnite forces. In 296 we see Appius Claudius Caesius and Lucius Volumnius Flammavolians as consuls for that year. The Etruscans were able to bring the Samnites were able to bring the Etruscans back into the war, but they had no chance of beating Rome alone. And that was the argument they said. It's like, look, if we're going to beat the Romans, we've got to do this together. The Etruscans hired Gallic mercenaries, and the Samnites were able to bring the Umbrians to their side. So this is it. The coalition is set, 296. Gallic mercenaries, Umbrians, Etruscans, and the Samnites. The Samnite commander, Gellius Ignatius, was leading the Samnite forces. Gauls and Etruscans were deployed to Etruria. So the Samnite army is moving out of Samnium into Etruria, where they can all converge and then fight the Romans. Volumnius captures various Samnite strongholds, and Volumnius defeats the Etruscans in a skirmish, and Appius Claudius the Samnites in a skirmish. And then to exploit that victory, they expand the war into Campania and Capua. And then we have, this is the decisive point in the war, the Battle of Centinium, which, the original strategy was to have the Samnites and the Gauls, being the most warlike and aggressive, form the center of the line and charge the Romans. And on the flanks would be the Etruscans and the Umbrians to envelop and surround the Romans and defeat them. Now, what Livy says in his history is that given their strength, if all four armies had united, he says, in the first encounter, the action was supported with strength so equal on both sides that had the Etrurians and Umbrians been present, either in the field or at the camp, in whichever place they might have employed their force, the Romans must have been defeated. So Livy's under no illusion as to what the fate would have been had they all joined forces. So the Romans decide they're going to do a little bit of a spoiling attack in order to draw off Umbrian and Etruscan forces. So what ends up happening is Quintus Fabius was sent to Etruria to pursue more scorched earth policies in order to draw them off from the army. And Volumnius was sent to Samnium, hopefully to draw off the Etruscans, or the Samnites rather. There was a Roman legion at Clusium, which was in the original Gallic War, utterly annihilated by the Senones, and it was again. And the annihilation of this legion was mostly kept secret because there were so few survivors. But there were deserters from the combined coalition camp that tipped Fabius off. And this is where Quintus Fabius creates this spoiling attack in Etruria. And the main battle of Centinium itself, the initial forces of the Gauls and the Samnites so the Samnites square off against the Roman right and the Gauls against the Roman left. The Roman right holds its line fairly well. The Roman left is crumbling under Gallic pressure. The Gauls, just like they did at Alia, the war cry in charge of the Gauls was beginning to break the Roman forces. And what was actually decisive on the Gallic side is Livy records that chariots and it sounds like wagons. I don't know how he envisions the wagons being used. The only thing I can think of is much later in the Hussite Wars, where Jan Žižka would basically, have his wagons charge down a hill like a battering ram into the enemy forces. And if that's how the Gauls were using them along with their chariots, it broke through portions of the Roman line. And the Roman commander Decius on the left devoted himself to the gods and charged into the Gallic lines, which sort of restored their morale slightly. And Quintinius sent cavalry to outflank the Samnites and pressure them to then push them away from the Roman right. Roman reserves also began to appear, and when the reserves appeared, the Senones, the Gauls who were attacked, were then pressured by the Roman left and the now appearing Roman reserves. And they were finally routed by Roman cavalry. And so then Quintinius took the Samnite camp, and Rome won its pretty much greatest battle up to that point. And at that point, it's pretty much over. The Gauls are just mercenaries. They're going to disperse into the ether. The Etruscans tap out. We're done fighting, and then the Umbrians also surrender as well. And then a full court press of multiple Roman commanders invade all of Samnium at once. Now there's no threat to the Romans. And in the years 293 to 290 BC, Samnium is invaded with Consul Spurius Corvilus Maximus, along with Marcus Attilius They invade along the middle Liris Valley and seize Iminterum. Spurius Carvillus marches to besiege Cominium, and Lucius Papyrus marched to the city of Aquilonia. Now, the Samnites, in one last desperate effort, this is kind of like their Battle of Berlin scenario. They bring up old men and young boys, and they tell them it's like a holy, war. You gotta swear an oath to the gods that you're not going to run away, and all of this. And eventually, the Samnites, while fighting a desperate battle, are eventually defeated by a Roman flanking maneuver by auxilia cavalry, presumably the Campanians who were present at Centinium. What's interesting is, though, at this point, while the Romans annex Samnium and the Sabines, they give them relatively favorable terms. It seems that while Livy's account of the Third Samnite War is cut short because we only have fragmentary evidence, that the Romans respected the fighting courage of the Samnites and tried to bring them into the fold of the Roman forces. And so at the end, and remember, this is 290 BC. Pyrrhus is engaging the Romans in around 280. So it's really only a decade between this war and Pyrrhus. But what we see is that now Rome has the resources to go toe-to-toe with the greatest military leader of the age, Pyrrhus. We know this because Livy records that Hannibal, when he was in exile in Asia Minor, met Scipio Africanus because he was in the employ of Antiochus, the Seleucid king. And they reminisced about the old days in Zama, and Scipio asked Hannibal, who's the greatest generals? And he said, well, clearly it's Alexander, and then Pyrrhus, and then you. And then he's like, but what if I had lost to you, Hannibal, at Zama? Then Hannibal said, well, I'll be the first one. Kind of a backhanded compliment to Scipio. But I mean, if Hannibal thinks that Pyrrhus was number two, I think we should, and all the great ancient generals, I think we should trust Hannibal's judgment at that point. And so at this point, we see that Rome has incorporated vast amounts of manpower reserves, effectively organized, effectively led, with a relatively loyal population. As we covered in the life of Pyrrhus, some Samnites defected to Pyrrhus, but as we'll see with Hannibal in the future, the Roman alliance structure was so firm and so strong that even short-term setbacks at the hands of Pyrrhus or Hannibal were not enough to pry away a crucial majority of allies. And at this point, Rome's steamroller is unstoppable. It's going to keep on going for the next 300 years.
Right. Yeah. Great summary. Yeah. And just as a frame of reference for the listener, what I find interesting throughout the course of all three Samnite Wars, as well as the Latin War, is that at the beginning of the first Samnite War, you have Philip of Macedon's campaigns throughout Greece against various Greek city-states. And then by the time the first Samnite War, the second Samnite War concludes, Alexander the Great dies in 323 BC. So, one of the great conquests of antiquity is happening all throughout Persia while the Samnite Wars are being fought. With the Third Samnite War in 298 BC, what initially sets up these Roman offensives is the consuls in the year of 298, where Cornelius Scipio Barbatus and Fulvius Maximus Centumalus are basically in charge of two separate campaigns. Scipio attacks basically the Etruscan countryside, and Fulvius attacks Samnite territory and wins a victory at Bovanium or Bovianum. And so regardless of this, this coalition that's formed against Rome, Rome is really the only belligerent here in this case that can attack on multiple fronts at once due to its manpower reserves. And again, this manpower system is basically unique, basically to the Roman system only, where these other tribes and other territories just don't have this robust system set up quite yet. Now, that's not to say that they weren't militarily worthy adversaries. It's just that the the system that it was in place to keep the Roman armies, supplied with fresh recruits, and more robust logistical system was in place, especially with the construction of the Appian Way, which allowed Roman armies to be resupplied in Campania much faster than any of Rome's adversaries. So again, they really are starting to get the logistical system down. Of course, the centerpiece of the Third Samnite War is the Battle of Sentinum, where, of course, you have Fabius makes up the Roman right and Decius, which makes up the Roman left. You have the Roman reserves behind Fabius' right-hand flank, and the Samnites and Fabius forces face off, basically with Fabius kind of maintaining more of a defensive posture, while Decius's forces are more or less being slowly worn down by the Gauls. And of course, as you mentioned, Decius basically offers himself to the gods in sort of a suicidal bravery charge into the Gauls, which, according to Livy, more or less kind of raises the morale of the Romans. And this allows for several flanking maneuvers on the part of the Roman cavalry. I think one thing that's interesting here is that throughout the course of the Second and Third Samnite Wars, you have the cavalrymen dismounting and fighting alongside these more formal infantry formations. And I think this is what makes Roman cavalry so deadly, is that this willingness to fight, several different styles in one particular conflict. So I think that was a really interesting note there. But of course, what ends up happening is the Samnites are worn down by Fabius's defensive postures, because the Samnites only were good at one particular. Let me rephrase that. The Samnites could basically only last so long in sort of a standoff, phalanx versus phalanx formation, or maniple versus maniple formation, and the Gauls. Not as, still the Gauls at this point are, according to the Roman perceptions, are still more, considered barbarians in comparison to these other Italian and Latin tribes. So they don't have these robust military formations, but they just have this barbarian-like willingness to just throw themselves at the Romans. And of course, the Samnites are eventually worn down, and the Gauls, most of the Gauls end up being enveloped. And we hear, according to Livy, that there is the use of chariots by the Gauls to attempt to attack some of the Roman cavalry. But by this time, the Samnites were overwhelmed, and the Gauls were basically routed out of the battle. So it's really interesting conclusions here, but something like 25,000 Samnites and Gauls were killed, and something around 8,000 Romans were killed. And this is one of the largest Roman armies that was fielded at this time, and they were outnumbered by about 10,000 men. So this is a huge victory for Rome. And this, at this point, as you had mentioned, the Samnites, whatever offensive initiative they had at the beginning of the Third Samnite War, was basically lost, and they couldn't marshal any further offensive operations against Rome just because of this loss. They kind of put all their eggs in one basket for this particular battle. That's not to say that the war was over, but as you mentioned, this is kind of a Battle of Berlin, late stage World War II type of a thing, where old men and boys were brought into the war as part of like a duty to serve the gods type of a thing. And at this point, though, Samnium was being conquered by the Romans, and there was just not much the Samnites could do at this point. And by the time Samnium was conquered, this left Rome as basically the centerpiece of Italy. That's not to say there was still Etruscan territory to the north. The Gauls obviously would be dealt with by Caesar several centuries later. But by the time Pyrrhus shows up, this is the Rome that he was facing. It wasn't a tribal Rome that was just confined to Latium. Rome was now firmly in the Apennine Mountains. They're all the way, north of the Tiber River Valley. They had Neapolis at this point. So, and by this point, Rome had surely, developed a reputation that reached all the way to Greece. And, and of course, this is kind of one of the great what if questions of history, where you have Livy talking about, Alexander having speculations to either invade Rome or possibly invade Carthage. It's basically the first alternative history, as you had mentioned early, but really interesting. But this is basically the end for all of, there's no more great attempts on this scale of various Latin tribes to go up against Rome in a unified coalition.
Exactly, and I think this is the trend we'll see in other conflicts with Rome. Usually, when they go to war with a comparable an enemy power of comparable strength, that enemy power isn't usually broken in a single conflict. As with Carthage, there were 3 wars with Carthage. As with the Macedonians, there were multiple wars with the Macedonians. But what happens is Rome has a gradualist policy, right? As they make new conquests, as they make new gains, they incorporate subject peoples into their army, whereas the Carthaginians and the Samnites and the Macedonians do not. And so there's this demographic drift where over time, Rome gets stronger and stronger, which allows for a battle of attrition mindset, and Rome's enemies get weaker and weaker, because not only do they have to replace the men that died in the war with natural birth, they can't even replace it with new recruits from subject peoples. Because even if they do win, such as Carthage's expansion into Spain under Hamilcar, they don't really fully incorporate the Gaelic tribes into their empire the way Rome incorporated the Samnites. So those expansionist gains are helpful, but they don't provide the same robustness of Rome. So what makes Rome different than Alexander is Alexander and his father Philip sought lightning victories, which could yield tremendous short-term gains, but in the long run did not yield long-term gains. Rome took a more gradual approach of laying a solid foundation, and as it expanded, that foundation allowed it to last and weather storms that, Alexander's empire collapsed as soon as he died. So what would be your final thoughts, terminal philosophy?
All right. Well, what you mentioned is actually a really helpful distinction between what I guess you could consider Greek doctrine and Roman doctrine. With a lot of Greece's opponents, mainly Persia, I mean, you have, we kind of come back to this again and again, but, Persia, with all of its territorial holdings, had this ability to raise huge armies, but the quality of those armies was very questionable when brought under, certain scrutiny or placed in certain settings where, they were forced to face a more highly trained and highly disciplined, more culturally homogenous Greek force. And so, with centuries of fighting the Persians and other tribes across, Anatolia and things like that, Greece became used to fighting, seeking out lightning victories, as you had mentioned. And this is, a good comparison to this is probably the early days of Barbarossa, where, you have large human wave attacks sent against the Wehrmacht. And basically the Wehrmacht just needed to use speed. Well, the German armed forces needed to use speed to create these huge pincer maneuvers and just envelop huge portions of the Soviet army. And I think, some people might be laughing, but I think the comparison is relevant here. Whereas you had mentioned with Rome, there was a whole, there was more things going on here, that these tribes were, due to the geography of Italy, these tribes were much closer together, and the mountains, the Apennine Mountains, make things more difficult too. it almost forced Rome to create two things: a robust military system that was, had this ability of self-reflection after defeats, and when it was given time to rebuild its settlements and reflect on defeats, it would learn from its mistakes. And also on the other hand, Rome was great at setting up this whole domestic political system, which could, assure other attempts at conquest. A lot of these other powers throughout antiquity, it was just this, it's kind of, all or nothing, put your eggs in one basket attempt at a certain victory. But yeah, Rome was great at setting up its own foundation. And so, I think that's a helpful distinction you made. And I think we'll see here, as we get closer to the Punic Wars, which we're coming right up on, I think we'll see, further solidification here, or just Rome solidifies its armed forces. I think it's, at this point, we've kind of been all over the map chronologically, but we already did the Pyrrhic Wars, but this is coming up to the Pyrrhic Wars from the other end, from the Roman end, and not necessarily the Greek side of things. So yeah, it's been interesting so far, but thanks for having me, and I'll see you in the next one.
Yeah, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Five podcast.